All right, welcome everyone to the Muskegon Community College lecture series in joint meeting with the Center for Experiential Learning. Thank you all for coming tonight to tonight's panel discussion on the war in Gaza and about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You know, I was saying, what more important place could you be? You know, even if it's your birthday, you should show up at something like this. And Kurt, it's his birthday, and he showed up here tonight. Oh, no, thank you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Kurt. So tonight's panel discussion, I just want to go over a little bit of the format. Each presenter or each person on the panel will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. We'll try to hold them to that. They're each teachers here, so they can talk for long periods of time. And then we'll ask a few follow-up questions. Maybe the panelists will have a question for each other. And then we'll open it up to you in the audience for questions. And you can do this in one of two ways. I hope all or most of you have gotten an index card like this, where you can write a question down and I'll be running around picking them up. Or you can raise your hand in the old-fashioned way and ask a question as well. So whatever you're most comfortable doing, we want you to be involved and ask your questions. I would first like to thank the Department of Academic Affairs and the college for their continued support of these lecture series. We can't do it without them. I think also I want to mention this. We've been doing lectures through the lecture series for over 20 years, and this is our third presentation this semester. We've got two coming up in the winter semester. On January 25th, there's a Pechakucha where we'll have, I think I have about a dozen speakers. So you think three's a lot. Wait till January 25th, and we hope to see you there. Pechakucha means chit chat. It's 20 slides, 20 seconds per slide. Goes pretty fast. You see some wonderful presentation and some real NASCAR-like crash and burns. So if you like that as well, come and see it. All right. That's January 25th. But tonight, I'm looking forward to our discussion on the war in Gaza. I want to introduce briefly our panelists tonight. First off, we have George Maniates, Instructor of History here at Muskegon Community College and Director for the Center for Experiential Learning. Then we have Dr. Conor Roddy. He's Instructor of Philosophy at Muskegon Community College, and perhaps most importantly, the Treasurer of the Faculty Association. So happy to have him. And finally, we have David Takitaki, who is an Instructor of Political Science at Muskegon Community College and Ferris State University, and perhaps most importantly for him, he used to be a student here. So. I have a couple of slides, and then we'll go into the talk from each of our presenters. First off, in the United States, we often use President Roosevelt's words that December 7th is a day that will live in infamy. October 7th, 2023, is a day that will live in infamy for Israel. It was their Pearl Harbor. On October 7th, Hamas fighters from Gaza entered Israel in a surprise attack, killing 1,200 people. They mostly targeted civilians, including children, parents, and even a large crowd attending a music festival. The picture up there on the right and the one in the middle are from the music festival. They also captured over 240 hostages, most of whom are still held captive in underground caves in Gaza. In retaliation for these attacks and to recover the hostages, Israel began bombing Gaza and now has started a ground offensive. To date, those battles have resulted in over 10,000 deaths, and over 4,000 of those are children. Gaza is only a 140 square mile strip that has a little over 2 million people. Approximately 1.5 million have been displaced internally in Gaza, in shelters, hospitals, and with other family members. Israel has also imposed a total blockade in Gaza, blocking the entry of food, water, medicine, fuel, and electricity, and consequently, over half of the hospitals in Gaza are closed, including 2 of its largest. The other hospitals are without essential supplies. So we might ask appropriately why. Why did this take place? What could possibly cause these atrocities? And the answer to these questions and this whole issue is complex. It's just simply not easy. They come with a long history that our first panelist, George Maniates, will start our discussion with.
Good evening, everyone. My name is George Maniates. I'm a history instructor, as Dr. Wible has identified. So what we're going to be doing here tonight, or at least my hope is to try to give you background, because you do not get the background if you look at the news. All you get is the events of the day, and it often is really out of context sometimes. You're often left scratching your head. Why do people have animosities towards each other? What's going on? Why are things the way they are? So it's my hope tonight not to give you a chicken and the egg analogy. If you're looking to see who was here first, you're not getting it from me, okay? That's not going to happen. But what we do need to look at is the impact of things beyond religion. This is not just a Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, Muslim, Jewish conflict, but we have to look at things like ethnicity, we have to look at conflict and conquest, what happened previous, how this area has been impacted by many different groups. We have to look at the idea of oppression. Oppression not only of Jews, but also of Muslims. We also must take into consideration imperialism and nationalism, because this has roots back to the French and British, surprise, surprise, who are not ever mentioned in today's news. So to go back, this is 14th century BC, and you see the world at that time. Well, the Mideast, as we see it, is under the control of the New Kingdom of Egypt. And a lot of this can be triangulated in terms of narratives from the Old Testament or other religious books where they talk about many of these typical stories. So our starting point is with the Canaanites in the Bronze Age, 1,400 years before the Common Era. And we're looking at really nomadic and semi-pastoral people, you know, the tribes. The area that this region possesses is not particularly fertile. It's a very arid, dry, tough place to live. And whatever's good in it, everybody wants it. So that's something you have to consider. But what we do know is at this time, eventually we're going to see 3 distinct kingdoms or areas. And I don't want you to start getting into the notion that there's boundaries. When you see something shaded, there is that means that probably these people were in that area. It doesn't mean that where that end of shading exists, there's a line. So I want people to have that as a cognition. But you notice the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judea, and this place called the Philistine states. Well, the Philistines are the Palestinians, the predecessors of the Palestinians. And this is around 830 BCE. This would be a map capturing it. You see a lot of the places that are in the news today. Gaza obviously is there. We see Jerusalem. We see Jaffa. But if you notice, the kingdom of Israel at that time, the dominance of the tribe of Israel went way up into Syria and Lebanon. Right? So there's a little bit of a difference here, isn't there? But this area has been highly contested over time. Different groups have come, conquered, and subjected the people of this area to their whims and whimsies, starting with the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE. And when they came in, many of these groups conquer, enslave, and loot and take. That's the way things went in the old days. They didn't fight wars or conflicts for half measures. Not like today where we have a war and then we kind of scratch our head, what were we doing for 20 years other than spending money? We had the Babylonians that rose up against the Assyrians, and they also took over the area that we're talking about, and they forced out, called the Babylonian captivity, forced many of the Jews and others to leave. Took them hostage, took them to rebuild their areas. And probably the most benevolent, if you can call benevolent in terms of a conqueror, the Persians. Because the Persians, they kind of followed Professor Maniates' axiom. Never mess with a person's religion unless you want to get them irritated. So they showed respect. As long as you believed what you believed, but you didn't mess with us, you paid your taxes, you did your thing, you're good. And that would exist all the way until Alexander the Great and the Macedonians came in. But we begin to see a rising influence throughout the Mediterranean basin of what we call Greek influences. We see it in the culture of the time. Now, we all know about the Egyptians. And I'm not going to get into Bible stories. I think you all know those, right? You've had that exposure to that. But the Egyptians took over in 404 BCE. But we also started to see a change in culture and language. The word lingua franca, that means the language of dominant administration and culture, changed. It's no longer Hebrew, it's a language called Aramaic, and it will be so all the way up until the time past Jesus. Aramaic was the dominant language, not Hebrew. So we see these things going on. Now this is the route that, of course, Alexander the Great took, his big conquest. Alexander the Great, for those of you who are not familiar, one of the largest conquests in the ancient world, and perhaps if you compare it to the modern day world, probably took as much or more territory than any other conqueror. Because not only did he take most of the Mediterranean basin, but he also went out almost to the edge of India. And if you look at the lands that he took, well, obviously Alexander was only a brief minute of time, because by age 32 he's dead. And he left no succession plan. All great leaders, you got to know in history, don't leave succession plans. Nobody writes down what the heck you're supposed to do after you die. So his generals fought, and a general by the name of Seleucus took over. Well, Seleucus didn't believe in, Professor Maniates' axiom, don't mess with people's religions, because this is the most holy spot in the Judaic world, King Solomon's temple. he converted this temple into a gym where people exercised naked. And they did everything to irritate the Jews. Well, he happened to irritate one person too many, and this is, I'm giving you the short story. If you want History 101, I'm taking enrollments, okay? Judas Maccabee, who led a successful Hebrew uprising. They threw out the Seleucids, and this is a big thing because this gave the Jews the strength and the courage to rise up against their oppressors. And we see throughout history the Jews have risen up, but not always successfully. But this really was a pivotal event. Well, the holiday of Hanukkah pivots around this event. And the successors of Judas Maccabee, as you notice, they began to annex and conquer all of the other areas and tribes. Look at the size of the conquest of these Hashemite leaders that followed him. He's taken over everything else. They've taken over everything. That works until the Romans come on the scene. A man by the name of Pompey, you know him, he's the other side of the coin from Julius Caesar, his main opponent later. They had conquered and taken over the area of what we call Palestine today. But notice that the Romans begin to divide this area, and they start to do some lumping here. Provinces, these are provinces. These are administrative states that the Romans used to govern. And they used this one administrative state called Syria-Palestina, that they lumped everybody in. Didn't care. Jew, Philistine, whatever. You're all under us. Now, the Romans did allow people to practice their religion, but guess what? The Jews aren't happy about this. They have now been subjected to, well, not only just taxes, but the whole administrative thing of having to render unto Caesar what's Caesar, and they don't like it. Period. They've had their taste of freedom, and now they're being put under the gun again. In 66 CE, the Jews rise up. There's 3 different uprisings that the Jews will undertake in about a 70-year span. The first one, they're put down. Nearly 1 million Jews met their death by the hands of the Romans. You mess with us, we're going to put you down. The Romans were particularly brutal. You obey the rules, you're good. But if you don't obey, you get knocked down. And ultimately, they destroy the Temple of Solomon. Temple will never be rebuilt again. The only remnant you have of the Temple of Solomon today is the Wailing Wall. And ironically, all the Abrahamic religions, the Jewish Wailing Wall, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Golden Dome are all within a stone's throw of each other. How ironic that 3 religions, you could throw a rock between the 3. The third uprising was the Bar Kokhba revolt. Another 500,000 plus were exterminated. And Jews, finally the Romans said, no more Jews can come you can't be in Jerusalem, you gotta go, get out of here. And this leads to something called the diaspora, where Jews are forced to leave. And where do they start to go? North Africa, Europe, They start to disperse. But they are stigmatized, aren't they? People that have risen up, that have done things that are not good. They practice a faith that's not like ours. Well, they're monotheistic. At this time, the Romans are polytheistic. But we also know that there's a rising religion, isn't there, called Christianity, that's beginning to emerge. But we will see throughout this period, going up until the 1800s, Jews, no matter where they go, will face some level of persecution and torture. Whether it's 2 more minutes, okay, well, I'm going to get going, Andy. All right. This is, of course, the Byzantine Empire. They ran their way through. Here's the highest place in Islam. This is where Muhammad came through. And the emergence of Islam begins to change relationships. And we're going to be able to see that this will last until the First Crusades, when Christians take over the Holy Land. And there's going to be further persecutions. There was 1 million+ people that were slaughtered when Jerusalem was taken. And the Crusaders only lasted a short time. Well, this is going to last until about the 1600s, when a group called the Ottomans, who are neither Arabs, not Christians, but Muslims from what would be a region like Turkmenistan today, from the east, come to power. And they will put themselves in the midst here of a caliphate, not really a caliphate, well, it is a caliphate, a conquest of North Africa, the Middle East, and most of the Balkans. But notice the area that is not included. What would be the Arab tribes? They're out of the mix. So we talk about wrong time, wrong side. Well, okay, what's the wrong time and wrong side? Well, that refers to the Ottomans' rise, because the Ottomans controlled so many different people that they had a great amount of problems. This man is going to change history. His name is Theodor Herzl. He is a journalist from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He is going to suggest that anti-Semitism, the persecution of Jews, there is no safe place in the world for Jews, and he proposes a homeland. He wants to go to Africa. Sounds like Marcus Garvey, doesn't it? He proposes that they go to East Uganda. Nobody's going to allow the Jews in East Uganda. Sorry. None of the major superpowers of the time are going to permit that, because they had their own territories going. But he sets the stage for the Jewish homeland. Fast forward, World War I, the Ottomans side up with the Germans and the Austrians. They're on the wrong side. England and France don't like it, and they conspire to get rid of the Ottoman Empire. And they do so with something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which is a secret agreement that tried to divide up Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. Now remember, they're trying to get the Jews to come back, because many of them have left. And the reaction to this really plays into a situation where the Jews and Arabs are played off against each other for the behest of the British. Clearly, the Arab population, Palestinian population, doesn't like it. 1936, there's a big uprising against the British. This man, Haj Amin al-Hassani, rises up. He's the chief cleric, the Grand Mufti, as they call it, of Palestine. He fails in his uprising. He flees for his life. And notice who he saddles up to in 1941. Yeah, good old Adolf, you know. Try to get your solace from him. Well, we all know the story. Jews were restricted from going back to Israel. 15,000 a year were allowed. But the years before World War II, lots of Jews want to emigrate. There's no place to go. U.S. isn't taking you. Can't go back to the British mandate. You can't go anywhere. You can't go to any place. You're stuck. And of course, a Holocaust occurs. 6 million plus people are exterminated, the vast majority of which are Jews. There is a collective guilt that the world feels. You know, how do you allow this to go on? This is ridiculous. Somebody should have done something. Well, guess what the solution for this is? Resolution UN 181, let's divide up the Holy Land, or the Palestine into 3 zones. Jerusalem would be an open city under international mandate because it's a holy place and nobody can agree. There'd be 3 Arab areas and 2 Arab areas and a set of Jewish areas. David, you want to go from there?
I will do my best. I want to thank George for several things. 1, it's a great setup. 2, he went significantly over, so when I do it, it won't look as bad. All right, so I'm going to ask you a question. George mentioned that October 7th, in many ways, for the modern nation-state of Israel is their 9/11, right? You, pretty much everybody in this room, has lived in the aftermath of that if you did not live through it personally. I will ask you to think back how you felt on that day and the days afterwards. You probably heard people in shock and in grief, and you probably also heard people advocating for retaliation, right? Sometimes retaliation in terms of prevention and deterrence, and sometimes, let's not mess around, vengeance, right? Hurt them badly enough they can never hurt us again. Fight them over there instead of over here. Because at the core of all conflicts are human beings. Think for a moment about the fact that you live in Michigan, right? And while I will not guess at the number of full-blooded Native Americans in the audience, I would wager that at some point in time within the last couple of 100 years, the land that you live on was not owned by people who looked or sounded like you. There are claimants historically. I'm here to talk about the politics of this, and politics is about people. It is about narrative. It is about what motivates us. And when you have tragedy, history, pain, suffering, and rage combining along lines that are difficult for us to navigate and discern, you begin to get an answer to the huge question that many of you came here tonight to try to find solutions to. How can something like this happen? Why does it keep happening? Because when we talk about people, we're talking about complexity, right? Yes, religion is a factor here, but not all Palestinians, as we define them today, are Muslims. And not all people who would be identified as Jewish people ethnically, or forbid you use the racial definition of it, right, or the racial contention of it, are practicing members of the Jewish faith. Individuals who are part of a nation, a conceptual nation. I'm not talking about a nation state, that's the next one. I'm talking about things like the Red Sox nation, right? Groups that find common cause, that are identified in terms of a nation, right? Differ from a nation state, a national identity. When we look at the Palestinian identity, there's cause to wonder how it came to be, and in many ways it comes about as a reaction to the incursions that we see into the territory as Palestine. They never identified themselves as Palestinians until the area was under threat. And yes, lastly, government. The decisions of government. If you try to talk about this and you conflate the people who follow the Jewish religion with the people who are ethnically Jewish, with the people who are living in the nation-state of Israel, with the people who are making decisions in the Jewish government or in the Israeli government, you are talking about different groups of people. Yes, obviously with some overlap. But you have to be able to make distinctions and analyze the behavior of individuals and their comparative histories. The same thing is true, of course, for the Palestinian side. If you are trying to figure out who in the region belongs to the Muslim faith and is therefore not necessarily going to receive the same kind of franchise in a Jewish state as others, that is different from those who identify as Palestinian, and may be different from those who are ethnically Arab, and certainly is different from those who identify with the Palestinian government that exists in the West Bank, and different from those who identify with the Palestinian government that exists in the Gaza Strip, which of course is Hamas, though they haven't had a chance to really vote on that since 2007. And there's some serious doubts as to whether they enjoy the kind of support that a government might enjoy. So before we can really get into this, this is what you need to know. This is complicated, right? There are not clear lines, there are not clear sides. And believe it or not, there aren't clear good guys. Many of us come to moments like this desperately hoping that smart people in the front of the room will tell us what we want to hear. There are clean sides, there are clean identities, and the people you like are good. I'm going to disappoint you. That's not what I'm here to do. George touched a little bit on the history. And what you need to know politically as for the history is that it is complicated. He touched on a little bit of the progression. These are the people who can reliably be called to have controlled the area of the Holy Land and or the city of Jerusalem since prehistory, right? George mentioned that the Philistines have some claim to Palestinian ancestry. If you ask the Palestinians, they're the Jebusites, right? They're coming out of the Hittite areas, right? You've got the Jewish kingdom, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Hasmoneans, the Romans who come in through conquest, the Byzantines, the Persians, the Umayyads, the Abbasids. It's noteworthy that sometime in the 1500s, they basically disassembled most of the walls of Jerusalem, and the place population plummets, right? Because this is a point of conflict. The Crusaders take it over, they lose it. They take it over, they lose it. Saladin, the Ottomans, and lastly, the British Empire. Why is the British Empire incredibly important here? Because the British make a lot of promises they don't end up keeping. And if you're talking about the modern political context, the narrative that leads to the creation of the nation-state of Israel and is the core of many of the grievances of the Palestinian people today, you're coming back to this. In 1915 and 1916, British Secretary McMahon engages in correspondence with one of the primary Arab leaders in the region, a sheikh named Hussein, and essentially the trade-off is this. You lead the Arabs, you rise up against the Ottomans and help us defeat them, and you get this territory. We will back an autonomous Arab state in this region. And then they renege on that agreement. After, of course, the Arabs rise up with help of noteworthy actors like T.E. Lawrence and successfully fight against the Ottomans. They deliver on their side of the deal, right? Well, it's noteworthy that there's a leadership shift in 1916. Prime Minister Ackwith resigns. Prime Minister George takes over. And in 1917, the creation or the declaration of the Balfour Committee, which was actually started by Asquith, arrives at a totally different conception of what the Holy Land will look like after the war. And the different conception is they're going to divide it up, that's Sykes-Picot, and Balfour Declaration specifically condones and puts British support behind the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people in the region. That's in 1917. Noteworthy, right? The population of the region in 1917 is about 13% Jewish. 87% remainder, the vast majority of those are what we would consider today to be Muslim Palestinians, right? And that is the scenario. And yet, we have to stop for a moment, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. You want to talk about the politics, right? Balfour happens because there have been individuals advocating for a Jewish homeland in the British government for years, right? And if you have any idea of the history that George presented about the persecution of the Jewish people throughout all of time, you can understand why, right? Why Zionism was about a home, a refuge, a place in which they can live free from the persecution that they saw in pretty much every other culture and civilization. I had the glory of going to Budapest not that long ago, and when you walk around something called the Jewish Quarter and realize it was built outside the walls for a reason, right? You have to understand that the scars of Jewish persecution are written into history. So the idea that you should want a place of your own, a home of your own, makes perfect sense. Of course, the place where they wanted it was occupied and has all of the same historical significance that George had mentioned. The 31% number is because by the time we get to the era of 1946, this is where the Jewish people have returned. The areas in pink, the areas more in a darker orange there, are where that 31% of Jewish people in the area live. Right? 31%. That's a big number, up from 13, but it's still not including 69% of the remainder of the population, who are largely Arab and largely Muslim. There's a good number of Christians as well. What does this mean? Well, this means that when the United Nations, Resolution 181 that George mentioned, proposes a plan to divide up this land, creating 2 potential nation states, they cut up the territory. They give to the Jewish people for a future state of Israel the areas in blue, the Arabs retain the areas in red, and the yellow zone, unsurprisingly the city of Jerusalem, is to be an international city, something that no one has specific control over, that everyone has access to for the purposes of their holy sites. That early action by the United Nations passes by a vote of 33 in favor, pretty much all of the Western nations and their allies, 10 abstentions, most of those outside of the Western sphere of influence, and 13 strong no's. Anybody want to guess who the 13 no's are? Every Arab country in the region. Now, what's noteworthy about the partition plan is it becomes part of the impetus for 2, or really 3 key events. The first key event is the eventual declaration of independence, because the UN sees the blowback from this, from all of the Arab countries, and does not take decisive action to attempt to implement it. Right? But the Jewish people are understandably tired of waiting. And they end up declaring independence. Now, the other thing that's happening in the background here is something called the Nakba. Because the Declaration of Independence by Israel and the subsequent war is not the beginning of Palestinian dislocation. Prior to May of 1947, prior to May of 1948, individual groups and gangs of Jewish militias went into Palestinian villages and killed people and started dislocating. It's hard to hear that, right? The quest for Zionism, not only ancestrally relevant, but fresh on the grief and loss of the Holocaust, puts us in a hard position, right? This is your chance at a home. You've got the international community behind you. Of course the people there and the surrounding nations don't want to see you take this over. Of course they're going to resist. And they do. But by that point in time, not only does the new nation state of Israel demonstrate that it can punch way above its weight in terms of its military capacity, but the incursions from surrounding Arab neighbors don't get nearly as much traction as they might have. And part of that reason is actually because many of the indigenous Palestinians who live in the area don't join the fighting. They don't try to kill their Jewish neighbors. There's a tremendous history here, going back to the Ottomans and beyond, of people who can live separately, though comfortably, in proximity to each other. And if you're going to look at one of the political dimensions of this conflict, you have to acknowledge the fact that the state of Israel, as it is contrived, is not a secular state. It very specifically is a Jewish state. And if you allowed for all of the people of Palestinian origin and or Arab descent and or Muslim faith to be full participants in the Jewish government, mathematically, if it's still a democracy, it's not going to be Jewish for long. Not governed by the principles of Judaism. You've also got a lot of conflict that comes from the conception of Arab law, specifically the idea of ijtihad, which is a Muslim principle that calls for the idea of very little, if no, separation between secular law and religious law. It's a much more complicated issue. But the result of all of this has been conquest. And this is what I want to highlight at the end of this. Conquest. That's what this is, right? In 1947, the areas in blue were ostensibly under Jewish control. The 47 partition plan fails. The 47-48 war happens, so that by 48 you have what we now know as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Subsequent wars in 67 and 95, along with additional conflicts and things like the Oslo attempts for peace, don't move this back in the favor of the Palestinians. Territory is lost. This is kind of what it looks like now. Now, I'm going to point out a couple of bits. First off, the areas in the darker color are the areas of exclusive Palestinian control. Those are the areas in which Palestinians have larger cities and larger villages. The areas in yellow are areas that have been joint controlled. Everything in white is now exclusively Israeli controlled. There are blue bits around on this map. Those are Israeli settlements. If you listen to Ariel Sharon in his speech, I believe in 2008, he explicitly talks about the Israeli settlement program. It is colonization. It is occupation. It is conquest. It has been the position of the Jewish government, the Israeli government, not the Jewish people, not innocent Jews who's trying to live somewhere, not the people who had a dream of a place free of persecution, but the nation-state entity in Israel has been systematically conquering territory from the Palestinians effectively since 1947. Now, remember I asked you to think about 9/11, right? It hurts when you lose things. When you lose land, when you lose territory, when you lose prominence, when the world ignores a slow-moving conquest, right? And there are lots and lots and lots of Palestinians who have, for more than 50 years, sat in refugee camps, hoping that someday they would get the right to return to territory that's been seized by the Israelis. Lots and lots of time. However, they don't get that right. And desperation leads to violence. The same kind of violence that led those Zionist militias to attack Palestinians in the 40s. This prompted the Palestinians to go from attempts at negotiation under the Palestinian Authority to voting for Hamas to something like October 7th. If nothing changes, what we are seeing now is the hottest part of the systemic conquest of Palestine. That's the political fact. That is what is happening, right? And it is happening with the express condemnation of the American government and many of our Western allies. That's hard to hear, right? But if you're going to ask the question, why is this happening, right? That is the why. Now, none of that excuses someone walking into a school and shooting at children, or walking into an electronic festival, taking hostages and killing innocent people, right? Dr. Roddy will talk more about the humanitarian side of this, the philosophical side of this, right? But the political side is actually pretty clear. This is conquest. Systemic, specific, continuing conquest. And if you want to understand it, then you have to understand it on those terms. It's not conquest because we like the people doing it or because we're sympathetic to their historical persecution. And thinking about how that deals with us in terms of humanity, thinking about how we react to that as people of the world is hard. But it will absolutely shape both the political and the philosophical dimensions of this issue. And for the philosophical dimensions of the issue, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Roddy.
Thank you, David. Thank you, George. I want to thank both of these guys for going so long, because that means that I can go for a shorter period of time. I don't disagree with anything either of my colleagues have said. I just feel pretty inadequate by comparison. I'm not a political scientist or an historian. I'm not a Middle East expert. Dr. Wible guilted me into joining this panel, and I am totally out of my comfort zone. I'm going to make a case that what the Israeli army is doing in Gaza is deeply immoral. And I don't think that the United States should be giving Israel its unconditional support. So I think my presentation is originally planned. I'm both overprepared and underprepared. It's too long. I'm not going to spend as much time on the philosophical framework of just war theory. I'm basically just going to cut to the chase because we don't have that much time. So I had planned originally to talk about the history of just war theory. We get various, we can go back to China, we can go to India. In the West, it starts with Augustine, because after the conversion of Constantine to Christianity, the kind of pacifism that you get in the Gospels, this idea that you ought to turn the other cheek, wouldn't quite cut it, and so Augustine looked through the Bible for reasons that could justify the use of political violence. More recently, you have this tradition of just war theory, where it's divided into basically two sets of principles. There's jus ad bellum, which is justice in resort to war, and there's jus in bello, which is justice in the conduct of war. And some of the ideas are going to be quite familiar, but again, as I said, I'm not going to dwell upon them. There's just cause, there's legitimate authority. It ought to be a last resort, so this is the principle of necessity. The means ought to be proportional, the idea being that the harms that the resort to war will inevitably eventuate in ought to be outweighed by the goods. It's not enough that the outcome is expected to be a good one. Also, there must be right intention, so it can't be some sort of a pretext, or you can't have an ulterior motive. A president might decide to engage in humanitarian intervention in the attempt to be re-elected or something like that. And there must also be a reasonable probability of success. So the key ideas are proportionality and necessity. To give an analogy, if the only way to save, well, not the only way, but if doing nothing to a gangrenous limb would result in the death of a patient, then amputating the limb would be proportionate because the good outweighs the harm. But if there's some other limb-saving surgery that could be carried out instead as an alternative, then it would be proportionate but not necessary. Cutting off the limb is a last resort in that regard. Some of the principles of jus in bello, or just conduct in war, are the same. Proportionality and necessity, and then there's the principle of discrimination or non-combatant immunity. I had planned as well to talk about some recent developments in just war theory. There's a revisionist school that take the view that we can't separate these two sets of principles. Traditionally, the individual combatants were only responsible for their conduct in war. So as long as they obeyed those rules, they were not held to be morally responsible. They're still not held to be legally responsible. But recent theorists take the view that, in effect, as I put it at the end here, there's no right way to do the wrong thing. And if you don't have just cause, then the only thing that you can do as a combatant that's fighting on the wrong side is to lay down your arms. Anything else is morally wrong. It may be excusable. There may be mitigating circumstances. People are often under duress. They are operating under assumptions that may turn out to be false, and so on and so forth. So the behavior may be excusable, but the claim is that it's not objectively permissible. And the traditional just war theory makes it too easy for soldiers to simply deny responsibility for their actions. If you join the Nazis and you make sure not to target civilians, then you haven't done anything wrong, but surely you have. Normally, the perpetrator of a crime is just as responsible as the accessory to the crime, the person who gives them those orders, but according to traditional just war theory, it's only the politicians who order the combatants into war that have done anything wrong. Anyhow, that's a very sketchy summary, but what I want to do is to take a quick look at how some of these principles might be applied. Some of what I have replicates what Professor Maniates and Professor Takitaki have already covered, so I'll skip through some of those slides pretty quickly. Whether or not Hamas has just cause, nobody's going to want to hear this, I wouldn't imagine, but we can't take for granted that they don't have a right to armed resistance. Oppressed and occupied peoples do have a right legally to armed resistance, according to the United Nations. Exactly what that constitutes is controversial, of course. But regardless of that general right, legally, the attack by Hamas on October 7th was clearly an instance of the commission of multiple war crimes, including deliberately targeting civilians and taking people hostage. And there are reports of various atrocities like rape and so on and so forth. It was completely illegal, and it was deeply immoral. It was obviously unjustified. There's no excuse for what Hamas did on October 7th. But as Professor Takitaki pointed out, Antonio Guterres, the leader of the United Nations, made this rather banal and obvious remark that the attacks didn't happen in a vacuum, and the Israeli ambassador had a temper tantrum and demanded that he resign. Not all Palestinians, of course, support armed struggle, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of them do. About half of Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip would support armed struggle against the state of Israel. And whether you think that that is excusable or understandable or moral is a separate question, but those are presumably reliable statistics from September 22, you can see, to September of 2023. The majority of Gazans have very little trust in Hamas. If we're talking about just war, we could say that Hamas is not a legitimate authority. Most Gazans don't support them. I think there was a poll by James Zalby in September where he said 11% of Gazans would consider themselves supporters of Hamas. So they don't trust them much. The large majority of Gazans do not support them. Hamas really came to power in a coup in that part of the Palestinian territories. The statistics here are maybe slightly different from the statistics that Professor Takitaki quoted, but about the same thing. You can see in 1914, approximately 90% of the inhabitants of mandatory Palestine were Arabs and 10% Jews. You can see that between 1914 and 1948, when Israel declared independence on May 14th, I think it was, the percentage rose to 33%. The partition plan gave The Jewish population, which was 1/3 of the population, about 56% of the territory, going back just a few years, they were only 10% of the population. It may not be surprising that the Palestinians and their Arab neighbors did not accept this plan. And you can see what's happened. We saw similar maps previously in the meantime. The West Bank, since the 1967 war, has been gradually settled by Israeli colonialists and divided up into little enclaves or Bantustans, where the indigenous Palestinian inhabitants have very little freedom of movement, and they exist under a completely separate legal regime with none of the same rights that the extraterritorial Israeli settlers have. You can call that expropriation, you can call it theft, but it's illegal under international law to move a population into occupied territory, and the state of Israel has just gotten away with this for decades because the United States keeps vetoing resolutions against them at the UN. There's another map of the West Bank in 2020, and you can see how little territory is controlled by the Palestinians. It's worth keeping these maps in mind when you hear about the so-called two-state solution. It's very hard to understand how a two-state solution would even work at this point, because there is no contiguous Palestinian territory remaining as the result of decisions that have been made by Israelis, and I think it's fair to say they're American supporters. So when Ariel Sharon decided to disengage from the Gaza Strip, I think there were maybe about 7,000 Israeli settlers living there, some of them armed extremists. All hell broke loose. That was very, very difficult to do. And he did it so that the Jewish people would have a larger majority in the rest of the territory of mandatory Palestine. It's hard to imagine how any Israeli prime minister could demand that about 500,000 armed and dangerous settlers leave the occupied West Bank. I don't know how that could work. It would be chaos, to put it very mildly. So I'm very pessimistic about the prospects for peace or for any long-term settlement. But when you hear about this two-state solution, there are a lot of Palestinians who think that that's just a fig leaf for the preservation of the status quo and the gradual theft of their land. You hear all of this stuff about Hamas wanting to wipe Israel off the map. And no doubt there are some maniacs in Hamas that would love to do just that. There's a percentage of sadists and psychopaths in every population. And if it's a population that's existing under conditions of dire oppression, there are probably more of those than in a population with a relatively good standard of living. But Netanyahu, you can see here on September 22nd of this year, gave an address to the United Nations in which he literally wiped the occupied Palestinian territories off the map. You just got Israel all colored in the same color. There's no Gaza Strip, there's no West Bank. And this is not by accident. This is a very deliberate signal to his extremist supporters in the most ultra-nationalist, right-wing Israeli government that has ever existed. If you look at the casualty statistics, these are from 2008 to 2020, and they're about the same going back. I couldn't find at short notice a good graph that went back before 2008, but it tends to be about 20 dead Palestinians for every dead Israeli, and that's been about the proportion or the ratio since 1948. It looks like it's heading in that direction as we speak since October 7th. Here's a little thought experiment. Imagine that somebody proposed this amendment to the United States Constitution. The United States is the national home of white people, in which they fulfill their natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination the right to exercise national self-determination in the United States is unique to white people. And suppose that some president was to say that the United States is not a state of all its citizens. According to the basic nationality law we passed, the United States is the nation state of white people and only them. Some people that are well informed probably know where this is going. That's exactly the law that Likud passed in 2018, amending the Constitution of the State of Israel to make it an explicit ethno-state. It's the national home of the Jewish people. The right to exercise national self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel. East Jerusalem is occupied territory, so they're just denying the status of the East Jerusalem region under international law. And they explicitly, this is an amendment to the Constitution, encourage Jewish settlement to promote the consolidation of Israel as a Jews-only state. There's the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. It's not a state of all its citizens. According to the basic nationality law we passed, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and only it. In 2022, you see, there's this subtle but very important change. The Jewish people have an exclusive and unquestionable right to all areas of the land of Israel. Not the state of Israel. The land of Israel is Eretz Israel, and that includes Gaza and the occupied Palestinian West Bank, right? So this is the intention of this government, to wipe Palestine off the map. They're not subtle about it. 2 minutes, okay. I would say that the state of Israel is not a democracy, it's an apartheid state. And that's not just my opinion. There's a legal definition of apartheid. It's not just the historical regime in South Africa. You can see here it's an intent to maintain domination in the context of systematic oppression, inhumane acts. It's defined under international law what the crime of apartheid is. There are plenty of instances of intent to dominate that we can look at. We don't have time, so I'm just going to keep going. Whether or not you're Jewish makes all the difference to the various rights you have, whatever part of the historical territory of mandatory Palestine you live in. There are horrific instances of abuse that are ongoing in the West Bank because the settlers there act with complete impunity. Nobody can tell if it's a settler or a soldier because Israelis all have mandatory military service, so they just take out their military uniforms and they go around terrorizing civilians. You can see here this kind of inhumane treatment, strip them, put out cigarettes, urinate on them, nothing happens. They never get punished because the army and the government seems to have their back, or at the very least, they connive at this kind of thing. Before October 7th, 197 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank. Nobody goes to prison for it, or very few people do. Since then, with everything going on in Gaza, 178 of them have been killed. So, according to B'Tselem, this Israeli human rights organization, they released a report you can see in 2021. We must look at the full picture and see it for what it is, apartheid, right? April of the same year, Human Rights Watch. Israel is guilty, the Israeli government is guilty of the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. It's not a temporary occupation. It's been going on for almost 60 years. There's no intent to withdraw. The intent is to continue to expropriate the land. February of 2022, Amnesty International, same conclusion, Israel is an apartheid regime. People have probably heard a lot about genocide. Genocide is maybe the crime of all crimes. You have to prove intent. Intent can be difficult to prove. It's not the same as ethnic cleansing. It's not just any old war crime or crime against humanity. But what I want to end with here are just some quotations, not from maniacs that are posting on Facebook or somebody that's drunk beside you on the bar stool. These are all from prominent members of the present Israeli government. All right, so the Israeli response to the October 7th attack, obviously they have legitimate authority, arguably just cause, but do they have the right intention? Netanyahu claims he's taking mighty vengeance. That's not a legitimate motivation for a defensive war. It's not supposed to be about revenge. Now, maybe that's rhetoric. It's understandable on the day, given the shock and grief and horror that Israelis have been subjected to. Look at the Minister of the Economy near Barkat on October 22nd. We've got a clear message to our enemies. Look what's happening in Gaza. You're going to get the same treatment. We're going to wipe you off the face of the earth. Right? So it's an exemplary punishment. They're doing this to Gaza to show people what's going to happen to them. That is by no means acceptable under the morality of just war or the law either, to the best of my knowledge. Here's the Israeli president. It's an entire nation out there that's responsible. It's not true about civilians. They could have risen up. So it's the Gazans' fault that they haven't overthrown the Hamas regime, and they all deserve the collective punishment to which they're being subjected. Again, collective punishment is immoral and illegal. Everybody has heard that there's this complete siege, no electricity, no food, no fuel, hospitals closed, babies dying. The emphasis, said the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson, is on damage and not on accuracy, right? A Knesset member on October 16th, I think this is when the video of the debate, the Knesset is the Israeli parliament, there was another member of the Knesset, I don't know who it was, who said, look, this is terrible, a baby is a baby, it doesn't matter if they're Israeli or Palestinian, it's all equal, babies are babies, they're innocent, it's not equal. It's not equal, she said. The children of Gaza brought it upon themselves. These are Israeli members of parliament that are making these kinds of remarks. Erase Gaza from the face of the earth. Let the Gazan monsters rush to the southern border and flee into Egypt or die, and let them die badly. More of this wiping it off the map language. Fire and brimstone. We need a cruel, vengeful IDF here. Anything less is immoral. There's no such thing as Palestinians, says Bezalel Smotrich. The New York Times is reporting that American diplomats are alarmed at the language that Israelis are using in private. They are referencing Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The previous Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, said, what are you talking about, these civilians, when asked about people on life support and babies in incubators in hospitals in Gaza? We're fighting Nazis. When Great Britain was fighting the Nazis, nobody asked what's going on in Dresden. They carpet bombed Dresden and killed about 25,000 civilians. This is genocidal intent. I'm not a legal scholar. I don't know what the bar is for prosecution of the crime of genocide, but these statements sound kind of genocidal, right? We have these laws that were instituted, the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statutes and so forth, after the atrocities that were committed on all sides during the Second World War to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And the Israelis are referencing this as a legitimate manual of military tactics. Okay, well, let me just, one more thing. This is Benjamin Netanyahu at the beginning of the grand invasion. Netanyahu is about as religious as Donald Trump is with that Bible that he held up, that you remember. This is what we call red meat to the base here. You must remember what Amalek has done to you, he said in a speech on October 28th. And we do remember, and we are fighting. Here is the biblical passage that he's referencing. Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you. Listen to the words of the Lord. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We shouldn't be supporting this. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank all of our panelists. I've got a couple of questions, but get your questions down. I'll start running around and picking them up while they're answering my initial questions here. One thing, a lot of you especially David Takitaki and Dr. Roddy were critical of Israel, given what they're doing with conquest and whatnot in the area. But also, I mean, and it's awful to see these children dying and the hospitals being attacked. But the Israelis say, hey, that's where Hamas is. That's where we have to go to get our hostages back. What do you expect? I mean, what alternatives do they have if they want to get their hostages back, if they want to root out Hamas for what they did on October 7th? Well, what do you think? Are they right to say that?
This is part of the horrors of war, because yes, Hamas is absolutely hiding assets and hostages in areas with significant civilian populations. They are doing so specifically to try to shield those from potential attacks, or to make attacks on those hostages or on those Hamas fighters or on those Hamas resources as costly as possible to Israel in terms of the narrative, right? They are using civilians as human shields, full stop, right? We can't shy away from that truth, right? They are doing that. Now, the question is, how do you get at Hamas if you're not willing to do that, right? If you're not willing to bomb hospitals, what it means is that you have to put troops on the ground engaging in the most costly type of engagement, urban fighting, in an area in which the ability to discern an enemy combatant from a civilian is nearly impossible. And strategically, the Israeli Defense Force is doing the math on all of those decisions and saying our loss of life, our loss of resources, the loss of personnel that would be necessary to try to accomplish these same objectives is too high. We would rather bomb the location, try to kill Hamas, and rack up the Palestinian casualties. Now that's cold. And I presented it cold because that is exactly the means of conversation that's happening, right? If it's going to cost us 2,000 people in a sustained offensive in Gaza, and those are flag-draped coffins we have to bring home to our families, right? Or I can push 3 buttons and send 4 airstrikes, and all of the casualties are on the other side. Do you want your government making that decision for you? Because that's the decision that Israel is making.
Well, I think they're also looking at the fact that they're trying to force the Palestinian people to out Hamas. There's 27,000 Hamas party members, call them party members or militants or terrorists or whatever you want to call them.
Use the mic there.
I think part of it is, at what point do 2 million plus Gazans say enough? You know, we don't want to be bombed. You took hostages, cough them up, do something. You provoke, you put your finger into the beehive, and now you're paying the price.
Can they do that? I mean, I don't think.
I don't know,
Palestinians have any
Andrew.
power
I don't
to
know,
do that.
Andy. I don't know how you undo a mess. This is the thing. This has gone on, and I think from the context you're hearing, this is thousands of years of a cobbled mess, all of which may not be the responsibility of Palestinians or the Jews. The mess that they inherited is somebody else's mess, and they don't get blamed at all. Where are the French? Where are the English who made this crazy arrangement? Nowhere to be seen. You hear anything in the news? British, French? You created this problem, like many of the problems that we're experiencing in the world are problems from the imperialism of that time, the British and the French, and their cobbled messes.
Just to follow up a little bit, maybe Dr. Roddy, what's Israel's alternative? If you don't think they should be in there fighting, trying to retaliate against Hamas and get their hostages back, what should they be doing?
Well, just to piggyback on what George said first, it is a mess. It's a tragedy. I don't know what the original sin was. The Balfour Declaration that the British government issued in 1917 is incoherent. People have called Israel/Palestine the twice promised land. And Professor Takitaki referred to that as well, and I think Professor Maniates. They made promises to the Arabs, they made promises to the Jews because they needed support to fight the First World War. And so the text of the declaration is really short, if I might read it out. It goes, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. It being clearly understood, my ass, pardon my French, that's incoherent, it makes no sense. The second part of the declaration was put in to placate Jewish citizens of the United Kingdom who were strongly opposed to the Zionist project because they thought that it would make Jewish people strangers in their own nations. So, sorry, there's that. But to your question, one of the principles of just war theory is that there be a reasonable probability of success. It's not clear what the aims of the grand invasion of Gaza are, apart from eliminating Hamas, which I think is impossible. You can kill 3,000 people or 30,000 people. The people that you don't kill are probably not going to say, well, that went badly. Let's just be nice now, and we've learned our lesson, and we promise not to shoot at any Israelis from now on. One of the other war aims is the rescuing of the hostages. But Netanyahu doesn't seem to be particularly interested in negotiations. And there's some reason to think that the death of the hostages is a price that they are willing to pay for whatever kind of campaign they're on. At the end of the day, there's no military solution. I don't know if there is a political solution, but I know there's no military solution. Somebody asked in the Florida state legislature, how many Gazans are you willing to sacrifice? And I can't remember the wonderful woman's name who shot.
Just a second here.
I want to follow up to this real quick, and then I'm happy to hand you the mic, Bill. There's a couple of points, because the question is, kind of where can we possibly go from here, right? And it is an important question, but in some ways it's the wrong one, okay? Because the idea is that there are some elements here. Is that going again? Both of them? All right. So I'm just going to talk really loud. Can you hear me? Awesome. Okay. The problem is we are working off of inherently contradictory base premises that don't have to be the way they are right now. If your goal is a territorially contiguous, dominant Jewish state run by Jewish people under the rules that Dr. Roddy presented, that is incompatible with Palestinian statehood in the region. And if your goal is a Palestinian state, right, that exists under the same circumstances without, Jewish involvement or citizenship, then that is incompatible with what Israel is doing right now. And what that does is it puts you into a war. It puts you into a specifically asymmetrical war, and that is what's happening right now. It is a long-term conquest. If you want a solution, you have to change the base premises, or you have to let things play out, right? Because what's happening right now is certainly apartheid, could be seen as ethnic cleansing, is potentially verging on genocide. But if things proceed as they will, eventually there will not be Palestinians in the territory that is currently referred to as Israel-Palestine. It will simply be Israel. They will be over into Egypt, or they will be over abroad, or they will have passed away from fighting in conflict. And then the issue will be functionally resolved. You'll still see insurgencies, you'll see terrorist actions and terrorist cells, but the question of the dimensions of the conflict will be resolved. If you want to resolve it in any way other than that, you have to change the base premises, and that requires either the change that Andy alluded to as being, I think, nearly impossible. How do you get 500,000 people out of these settlements? Or a change in the inherently Jewish nature of the Israeli government. If you want a one-state solution and you're not going to let people who aren't Jewish be citizens, that doesn't work. You have to challenge the base premises. Because right now, the base premises as they've laid out are not compatible, and that's going to lead to conflict. I want to leave it for Bill. He had a question.
I want to get to questions. One of the things that go, just to kind of reply to that, and then we'll get to some questions here, but this question from one of the cards is what Arab states support Hamas, and we're worried about what will happen beyond the borders of Israel, and if there is only one Israel and that takes over, would Arab states that are supportive of the Palestinians allow that? So.
I'll respond to that first and pass the microphone down. The answer to date has been that there are a number of Arab states, including specifically elements within Lebanon and within Syria and within Jordan, that are supportive of Palestinians, right? They have varying levels of support for the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the government that existed in the West Bank. But support for Hamas, given their background, has been somewhat tepid. And if you want to find the main supporter of Hamas, you actually look outside of the Arab world to Iran. And that's where you see a large channel of support that is both idealistic and strategic, specifically in their opposition to Israel. Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, the Iranians are not Arabs, so we don't have to, and they're Shia versus Sunni, which is a whole other issue. There's a religious issue that throw in there. It is clear from the actions of the neighboring states, nobody wants to own the Palestinians. Egypt didn't open its borders to allow the people to leave Gaza for safe passage. They want nothing to do with them. Jordan hasn't embraced any of these people. It's a mess. And the British had 30 years to fix it, but they didn't do it. So here we go.
All right. I think, Bill, you had.
I have so many questions for all of you, but I'll just ask one. In 1947 and 48, when Israel was formed, what did they think they were doing? The formation of Israel was colonization. Colonization is conquest. Did they think that the Arab people would just say, we're so damn glad we want to be a part of the world government of the UN and a nation state? The conflict begins right there. It begins, it seems to me, because the people who created Israel were operating from a nationalist point of view. And as a result, what you get is this. That's one question. Just a second question. Religion and race are incompatible with a world government of nation states. It's that simple. You cannot have a nation state that is based in religion or race and expect no conflict. It's impossible.
Well, that's part of nationalism. Common culture, common language, common religion, shared experience. You know that, Bill. You've taught that a number of years. But the issue here is, clearly, we probably ought to get in the mindset of, Ben Gurion when he was setting up the Israeli state. But think about it, 1947, 48, the vast sentiment of the world is with what? You have just experienced the worst Holocaust, 6 million people, and everybody was sitting on their hands. This could have been alleviated, allow the Jews into all the Western countries, but nobody wanted them, did they? And after the Holocaust, are they going to remain in Europe? That answer is clearly no.
I just want to remind questions to be brief, but.
I think it's important that we understand the historical development of Israel and the United States based on capitalism. And we do not know, we don't understand the culture of the Palestine people, and we just use that for the excuses for, you can't colonize a people and live. Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. I think the people in Pakistan want liberty. And we got a president that standing behind Israel. We are in a big deficit crisis in this country. But yet, when they tear down the Gaza Strip, we're going to build it back up, United States. with our tax dollars. And then we're going to take control too on a capitalistic, platform.
So I think that it is absolutely accurate to note that, you know, there are economic and strategic interests playing out on all factors. And to kind of go back to what, you know, the previous question was, the idea of, you know, what was expected, to some extent it was this, right? The quest and the goal of Zionism, if you ask the people at the time, they much would have preferred it to be bloodless. They much would have preferred it to be simple. They much would have preferred everybody else get up and move out. But this was, to some extent, the end game. And there are members of the Israeli government right now who do see it, that this is potentially the end game, right? The opportunity to reoccupy Gaza, create another, you know, 1 million or 2 refugees, seize that territory with some element of international support, including that of our country, is pressing and prescient. And yes, our strategic goals in the area, absolutely, have to do with, you know, supporting Israel as a cultural bulwark for people who kind of look and think and align with us, as opposed to the Palestinian culture and the Muslim religion that is, you know, steps removed from the American standard. It's worth noting, yeah, there's probably going to be money to be made, and that gets very complex, and it's hard to allocate those specifically. But you're right, our tax dollars have been going to Israel for years, and more of them are online to go to support this. I want to point out briefly that there is a counterpoint, and it's a strategic counterpoint if we want to get into the politics of this. Netanyahu's on dangerous ground. He was already on the verge of corruption charges when this began. He has solidified under a unity government, but his margins previous to this were very, very narrow. And this is seen in many ways as kind of do or die, make or break. Had our administration, as much as it's controversial, come out anything other than adamantly behind Israel, it's very likely we would not have a seat at the table. Now, you can't say for certain what would go on, but many astute scholars of international relations have suggested that part of the Biden administration's strategy in being so publicly pro-Israel is that you're out of the room unless you're that way right now. Netanyahu is brokering nothing and listening to no one. Your only hope for things like brokering the humanitarian pauses that we're currently seeing, or trying to get something like reasonable scaling in terms of reciprocity, have you in the room. Now, I don't know if I buy that completely, but it's worth noting that that's part of the argument.
Some questions from our cards here. Shouldn't the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more properly be called the Israeli-Hamas conflict? What do you think?
Well, I would tend to agree with that, because I don't think the Palestinian people as a whole are embracing this. You know, it's clearly there's a faction of people who are pushing the agenda. And if we wanted to de-escalate this, who do we negotiate with? That's the question I have, you know. Okay, give the hostages back. Let's do over. Can it happen?
Why is it that we see on news, Netanyahu was all over the Sunday news stories and programs, but we don't see Hamas? Is there conversation with the leaders of Hamas? Again, you mentioned who do we negotiate with?
Can I? I don't know if this is an answer to that question. It's more of a moral than a strategic or a realpolitik style answer, but the double standards are appalling to me. There's a video that anyone can find easily online of John Kirby, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, I think. I don't know, it was about maybe 6 months ago or something like that, and he's making this speech about the horrors in Ukraine. And he's crying all of these crocodile tears. He pretends to be overcome with emotion. He can't even carry on speaking. What kind of a person could possibly do such a thing? Fast forward to what's happening in Gaza. Well, war is ugly. It's messy. It's awful. But we already knew that. The United States is losing so much credibility in the eyes of the international community because it is so obviously not an honest broker. The current administration is completely unresponsive to American public opinion as well. 19 Congress members voted for a ceasefire. About 2/3 of the American public are in favor of a ceasefire. Rashida Tlaib, as people probably know, got censured for using this "from the river to the sea" phrase, which people interpret differently, but it rhymes, and they chant it at marches. Meanwhile, you have Republicans calling to bounce the rubble, wipe Gaza off the face of the map, all of this sort of stuff, and nobody says anything to them. I think it's really appalling that we have these double standards. And again, it's noted everywhere in the world. The US has very little support. I think apart from the US and Israel, 12 nations voted against the proposal to call it a ceasefire. Out of those 12 nations, 6 were small Micronesian island states that are just bribed and bullied by the US.
Why do you think that the US is so concerned about calling for a ceasefire? Why don't they, if that's what the populace wants and that's what would get good international support?
I don't have a good answer to that. Maybe one of my colleagues here does. I find it incomprehensible.
Maybe it's perhaps time that we ought to look at our foreign policy, period. Why are we continuing to pick winners and losers? Why are we shipping treasures to arm people and to cause problems in the world? 100 billion to Ukraine. God knows how many billion want to go to Israel now. When we have people sleeping in the streets, we have homeless veterans, we have a drug problem that people can't get counseling for. What are we doing? Are we to be the gatekeepers for everyone? At some point, we have to disengage and figure out what is best for us. You can't take care of the world before you take care of yourself.
I don't know. We're an international superpower. We have a responsibility to the world. Huh?
No, we don't.
Yes, we do.
Right.
I disagree.
So let me weigh in on this. You can place that idea of responsibility or not, but the current strategic analysis is that a capable, armed, friendly Israel, who is doing the vast majority of the fighting in the region and provides strategic support for all of the remainder of the American agendas in the Middle East, is our best mechanism for imposing our will and our agenda on that region without putting boots on the ground or spending even more blood and treasure than we do. Now, that is debatable in terms of its actual efficacy, but that's the strategy, right? Support them, reinforce them, let them be our bulwark against other regional concerns, right? Keep Iran busy in some ways, keep in many ways an active check against potential Saudi Arabia, or even just keep some elements of the Islamic movement within the Arab world splintered amongst itself and pointed at them as opposed to organizing itself and pointing itself at us, right? That is the math that many of the people who are saying, look, this is in our interest. And whether or not you believe we have a responsibility to be there in order for humanitarian or the furtherance of democracy, or if you're pissed about it and would like nothing more than for us to get out of that, right? This is the strategic calculation that in many ways is used to keep us there.
Here's a question from the card, and then we've got a hand up. We have two sides that have a long history. We know that there's hatred in both directions. Do we have any example of two sides living in peace after so much hate?
Well, I don't know if I'm the person to answer that question, but there are people in Northern Ireland who aren't blowing each other up anymore. They're not all in love, but the war is over. And if you want to end a situation like that, you got to sit down and talk with people that you hate, people that have blown your friends to smithereens. I think, again, that the United States, I know that the story is that behind closed doors, the Biden administration is doing its best to put pressure on the Netanyahu government. But I think they've lost an opportunity to win at least a sliver of credibility in the Arab world and in the Middle East. Biden could have said, look, here's what is acceptable and here's what's unacceptable. He could have drawn some red lines and said, if you cross these lines, we're going to cut off political, diplomatic, and economic support. He lost that opportunity. It's very hard to disengage now after you go over and bear hug Netanyahu in public. So, yeah, there are examples in which seemingly intractable conflicts have been resolved. It's never perfect, but it's better than people getting slaughtered.
Here's a question.
Thank you, gentlemen, for doing a great job giving us some different perspectives. The one thing, this doctor on the far right, your left, is you talked about our policies and our philosophies, the U.S. government. I sit here and think about Iran, and I think sometimes that part of our philosophy there, keep our hands in the pie here because of Iran. Who are they backing? What are they doing? I don't know what the opposition is doing behind us. All of the world knows we're backing Israel. And I don't disagree with what the gentleman in the center said either. I think sometimes we need to, just pull our guns back, take some of our ammunition back. If the other side would do that, maybe these two will come together and start talking. I don't know how to make that happen on the other side, but if Iran keeps feeding it, we can't stop feeding it. But somebody's got to get here. How about the big boys sitting down and talking about it and saying, hey, look, let's get these two to kind of quiet down a little bit here. Let's slow it down, like you said. Let's stop these arms feeding. We're feeding it. Everyone's feeding it. They can't make it themselves. So to me, that's kind of what I thought that's what the UN is supposed to do, That's just my thought. I don't know if that's a question or not, but I'm just repeating what you said, but I think you hit it right in the head myself. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I love that this is still stuck up on the screen up there. Briefly, I should say that there was an interview with from oh my goodness, from Mark Lamont Hill, who was fired from CNN eventually, with the former Israel spokesperson for Hamas. What was his name? There is an interview out there. I'm just curious. Where is Israel getting all of their weapons? And why would America be so invested and not do some of the things that you presented of like, well, Biden could have done this. Why would he not?
I don't know. I'll hand it over to Professor Takitaki. I think it's ideological. I think Biden is a genuine Zionist, but I don't think it's wise.
So, complex question. We, at this point in time, in terms of our global and strategic position, specifically with the idea of the Middle East and in conflict with Iran and other potentially hostile elements in the region, have supported Israel realistically since 1947 and before, right? Where did they get their arms? They have significant now domestic arms manufacturing capacity on their own, but they have had significant support from us and other Western countries over the years who have supported them not only because, yes, the Jewish people, not the Israeli government, let's draw that line of separation again from it, certainly deserve to have a place where they're not oppressed, or otherwise condemned to live as second-class citizens, right? So there's sympathy on that element, and that goes before and after the Holocaust. But then there is also the idea of the military and strategic regional presence and regional power. If Iran, right, metastasizes as a more active threat, Israel is not only their first target, but likely the first line of defense for the rest of the world, right? And that alone would be worth, in most people's understanding, the strategic expenditure of potentially billions of dollars to support that, right? And that's one of the, again, kind of cut it down to the motivations. Now, I'm leaving to some extent my personal opinions about the morality of these particular decisions out of this analysis, and I think that's important because this is what the operational functions of government, and on both sides of the aisle, right, have been doing for quite some time, right? We can't point at Republicans or Democrats and say, they're in bed here. Also, it's important to note that while there is that level of differentiation between the Jewish diaspora worldwide and the Israeli government, there are lots and lots and lots of Jewish people in the United States who have friends and loved ones, family members in Israel right now who have lost people to the October 7th or lost people over the years, right? and are actively campaigning within this country to maintain support for Israel. Not because they want it as a strategic asset, but because those are the people who share their ethnicity, their faith, and their blood, right? And it's difficult sometimes when you have to parse someone who's like, no, my entire family is there in one of those villages, please, make sure they're safe, to somebody who's like, I am interested in the strategic advancement of American interests in the region, to somebody else who's actively Zionist, to maybe somebody who does harbor some biases and bigotry against either Palestinians or Arab ethnic individuals, or is simply Islamophobic, right? Because all of those people can be doing the exact same action in the United States, which is actively supporting and campaigning for American dollars to go to Israel. And I'm not in their minds or hearts. I can't tell you which one is motivating them at the moment, but I guarantee there are people who are motivated by all of those factors. And why does the U.S. do what it does? Because there's a lot more people here who are campaigning about stand strong with Israel than there are concerned about what's going on in Palestine. We present this information, I know both Dr. Roddy and I do, with some knowledge that the narrative presented in the American context is largely pro-Israel, it's largely pro-West, and it doesn't acknowledge things like the Nakba, right? I've had times in my class where I've walked through this history and documented it, and I've had students get up and leave, right? Because this is such a tremendous difference than everything else they've heard. But it's true. And it's the reality for the people on the street, in the Arab street, and on the ground in Palestine. Right? So why do we do things the way we do things? The civilians in the United States line up behind one issue and not the other. And some of that's ignorance, and some of that is preference, and some of that's bias. And you got to acknowledge all of them.
Can I speak to that just really briefly? There are, of course, plenty of American citizens of Jewish ancestry, and there are dual nationals and so forth, and a lot of American Jews support the state of Israel. There are plenty that do not, and we can't leave those out. And there has been for decades a very effective campaign to smear critics of Israel as anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism is obviously very real. It's a horrible, ugly thing. It wasn't just the Germans. The Europeans committed one of the worst atrocities in the history of humanity against the Jews. I'm a European. That's part of my shame as a European. But the occupation is bad for everybody. It's bad for Israelis, morally speaking. It's a corrupting influence. It's a brutalizing influence. All of these young Israelis serve 2.5 years in the military, and they go around and they have to police these oppressed people on the West Bank, and it's bad for their soul. And there are plenty of reports, you can read reports by people who can't live with what they've done, and a lot of it is just very ordinary, everyday stuff, but it's really bad to give young people that kind of power and that impunity. And you can see what's happening to domestic politics in Israel. It's becoming increasingly fascistic, because there is this contradiction at the heart of the project. I'm sure my colleagues are familiar with it. It's been called the Zionist trilemma. Israel arrived late to the party. If they'd gotten there a couple of hundred years ago during the age of imperialism, they could have done what Professor Takitaki referred. They could have cleared all of the Palestinians out, and it would be ancient history problem solved. And some of them are explicitly saying that. We should have finished it in 48. Let's do it now while we have the chance. But that sort of... that's going to leave a very serious psychic wound on the national character. So the Zionist trilemma is this: you can have a state of Israel that is either Jewish, democratic, occupies all of mandatory Palestine. You can take any two of those things, but you cannot have all three. It can't be simultaneously Jewish, democratic, and cover the entire territory of mandatory Palestine. It could be that if they manage to ethnically cleanse all the Palestinians out, but what kind of a democracy wants to be founded in that way?
All right, got another question here.
So I have a friend that I knew in high school, and he has family in Gaza. He doesn't know what's happened to them. He hasn't had any contact with them whatsoever. We can only assume the worst from that. How is it not our duty to, as U.S. as a whole, how is it not the U.S.'s duty as a global superpower to help these people. I mean, they are suffering to the point of, I mean, it's a hellish situation, really. So how is it not our duty as a global superpower to help?
So, in short, there's no rule book for what being a global superpower means, right? We are still ostensibly a democracy. Our policies are guided, or can be guided, by the will of the people, right? And, as you may have heard even amongst this room or amongst this panel, there are divisions, right? Deep, sincere divisions from people who do have the best of intentions, right? Some people want to see America go forward and defend people who are in pain and hurt and look after humanitarian issues across the globe, even if that costs us blood and treasure. Other people want to concentrate our resources and shift the plans and try to make our own problems, kind of go away, or at least more mitigated, look after the people who are paying the taxes and potentially doing the fighting, right, before we extend ourselves externally. That's an inherent disagreement. And I think there are good people on both sides of that disagreement. And if you ask, why aren't we doing it, it's because we don't agree. We don't agree on what that looks like.
Dr. Roddy, you argued essentially that the United States have an obligation to stop it, right?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I guess individuals have an obligation to do what they can to make the world a better place. If you want to think of states as moral agents, states have a corresponding obligation. Beyond that, I'm not sure that I have anything particularly meaningful or insightful to say, but yeah, if something awful is happening and somebody can do something about it individually or collectively, there's some sort of reason to act in those circumstances.
Simply, the world has to take this problem on. We cannot do it alone. We keep looking at us as the solution. And every time we get involved, we put our imprint on it, and it doesn't always work. Look at how many times in the world we've stepped in, and we've left it worse than better.
But the United Nations wants a ceasefire, wants to stop the atrocities. But
Okay, here I got to push back a little bit because, the United Nations is an incredibly important body for international communication and accord. It exists precisely because the absence of it is detrimental. And if you've ever found yourself speeding in an area where it's illegal but being polite to people for no reason, you understand the power that soft power can have on human behavior. The United Nations is a vital organ, and we can ignore it at our peril. We don't like it because it doesn't have teeth, right? That's the constant complaint against the United Nations. Pass these resolutions and nothing happens, right? Well, if you're going to amass something like the political will to do something in this country or amongst nations, right, you have to begin with that level of communication. You have to begin generating human interest and human action to try to change things. Right? And you need precisely the kind of communicative body that the United Nations is if that's going to start to happen. I could go off on this for hours. I'm not going to. I want to get to the other questions.
Yeah, okay. I have one question here, and then we got to start turning towards the end.
We hear on the news two different terms, ceasefire and humanitarian pause. Now, I'd like somebody on the panel to say, is my thinking correct? Ceasefire means it's all done and Israel loses. Hamas remains in place. Humanitarian pause for a few hours or even days is something that lasts for a short time and does a lot of good.
So effectively, a ceasefire, as it has been described in terms of international law, is precisely what it sounds like. It is a cessation of hostilities. It does not necessarily mean it is truly permanent. Ceasefires obviously frequently happen and then are undone by events. It is different from what we consider to be a formal armistice or an absolute declaration of peace that normally requires all of the belligerent parties to effectively declare the end of hostilities, right? A ceasefire is simply we are going to stop shooting at each other, right? A humanitarian pause is generally an announced temporary ceasefire for a period of time to allow for things like the potential extrication of the wounded, the delivery of humanitarian supplies to civilians and the like. Now, who decides whether or not a ceasefire at this moment would be a win or a loss for the parties? That's a much more difficult prospect. I think there are people who would say that the analysis is that Hamas has already lost more than it could gain if things stop right now, and other people who would say Israel would be inviting potential further actions against it if it stops short of what it's doing or what it's going to continue to do. So the only part of that I would quibble with is the analysis of who wins if things stop fighting right now. I guarantee civilians on both sides would likely win if things stop fighting right now.
I want to go to one question that I've gotten a few times here on the cards, in a little different ways, but how can the administration, how can people in general stop anti-Semitism that is happening in the U.S.? And it might address, whether that is really a concern.
Is anti-Semitism a concern? Absolutely yes, right? We see it materializing in all sorts of rhetoric from individuals who are both, kind of probably have been anti-Semitic for a long period of time, or those who find it convenient politically to blame the Jewish people for everything from international conspiracies to banking or whatever. There's all sorts of historical anti-Semitic tropes that are used to essentially demean, dehumanize, and potentially victimize the Jewish people. The American population is not immune to those things. They take active roles in many parts of our politics, and as we've seen rises in extremism in this country, along with echoes and elements of effectively authoritarianism or fascism, many of the strong nationalistic tendencies that are present in those groups echo anti-Semitic rhetoric. Right? They use it as a rallying point. It is one of the thems that they try to differentiate in terms of us's. So yes, in terms of how can we, domestically, try to combat anti-Semitism, we've been attempting to do it for a long time. However, elements of education, elements of awareness, being able to do something like discern the plight of the Jewish people and innocent people who follow that faith or belong to that ethnicity from something like aggressive actions by the Israeli government is crucial, right? Being able to look at our Jewish friends and neighbors and go, you have a right to live and a right to worship as you please, and you're a part of our community like any other, is the beginning of that. But we can't ignore the history. We can't ignore the persecution. We can't ignore the fact that there are people in probably our community right now who are still concerned about what it looks like when someone finds out they're Jewish, right? People who hide elements of their own identity amongst their friends because there is, a historical precedent of oppression and persecution, right? We have to begin to acknowledge that. And yeah, there are other things in policies, but it's not like discrimination is legal, right? It happens anyway. That front will probably happen in terms of education, in terms of awareness, in terms of community support. I'll pass it over to anybody else who wants to tackle that.
Well, we have to just look in our own community, go to the doors of Temple Beth Israel and look at the sign. It's not welcome. It's unless you call in and we know who you are, you're not coming in. Why, I asked the rabbi. Because there's people that want to do bad things to us. This is Muskegon. These are our neighbors. These are the people we know. Why do they feel this way? I don't know the answer, but I know it's a problem. So we need to own the fact of what David just said. We have to protect everyone and respect everyone. And we must snuff out hate where hate exists. Because the narrow minds cause problems. Right, left, sideways, I don't give a damn. Hate is hate.
I want to kind of turn towards the end here. There's a question of how can the hostages be returned peacefully? And I want to combine that with just a general thoughts, and you've said a little bit, but how do you see this ending, or maybe not ending, but how do you see perhaps a peace occurring, or the future of these events that we've seen?
Before I get to hostages, I just want to do one thing, because George is absolutely right. We do have to fight hate wherever it is, and I cannot, of good conscience, talk about anti-Semitism without also talking about Islamophobic tendencies that exist within the population, right? There was a young boy who was recently killed because he was Palestinian, right? And that's in the United States because of people who look at those who look differently or speak differently or worship differently than we do and seek to do violence out of hate, right? And I want to make sure that we're giving a proper acknowledgement to the fact that people come after Jewish people, and they come after Arabic people, and they come after Islamic people, and that is deeply and inherently wrong on all levels. So, but turning to the hostage thing, and I will pass this down as soon as I kind of think through this, there is an opportunity for a brokered peace, right? Right now, Hamas has put forward some terms about the release of prisoners held by Israel. Now, some of those prisoners are functionally terrorists, right? Others are Palestinians that have been apprehended or captured or were simply vocal in their resistance to Israel. Not everyone there is going to strap on a bomb or a gun and come back at Israel as soon as they are freed, but certainly some of them would, right? And that was one of the points that Hamas is trying to make. Make no mistake, right? There are elements in Hamas who understand or understood precisely what this would do, right? And are hoping, on some level, that Israel's response would do exactly what it's doing now, right? Kill civilians, move towards the completion of a conquest, and get people like us talking about it, educating each other, right? It's difficult for us to acknowledge the fact that in some ways there are members of Hamas who are getting what they want because we're all becoming better educated about this, right? And that's an awful, awful thing to contemplate, but it is true.
And don't they also want a larger escalation of war in the region?
Potentially. If that leads to, right, a potential liberation for Palestine. Okay. Again, there are members of Hamas who are not ideologically blind, right? They're strategic, just like there are members of the Israeli Defense Forces who are not ideologically blind, they're strategic, right? Everyone is looking toward accomplishing a specific set of goals. And one of Hamas's goals is the liberation of Palestine. Now, some in that want that to result in the destruction of Israel. Others would be happy for something like a contiguous state and a two-state solution, right? I mean, we're talking about a lot of different potential desires and outcomes. So is the opportunity for a brokered peace real? Yes. Are there currently conditions that seem to be indicative that that's going to happen? No. Right? Right now, Israel is very, very happy to be moving forward with this offensive campaign. They're unhappy with why it started, right? But if they can continue this with a measure of international support and severely damage both Hamas or potentially depopulate big chunks of Gaza, that's a win for them, right? On the flip side, if Hamas comes out of this with what we're seeing now, which are big Palestinian protests in cities around the world, pro-Palestinian protests, and a new awareness of what's actually been going on and this systemic conquest we've talked about since 1947, they're getting what they want too. We talk about peace. The question is going to be peace on what terms? What does it look like?
All right, thank you. I think I want to ask kind of a final question, which is that if people want to be involved, if people want to stop the fighting, if they want to help with humanitarian efforts, what do you suggest they do? I mean, we all kind of like, what can I do? What do you all suggest?
I think the first thing is to educate yourself fully on the topic.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, this is a good thing that you're doing. Hopefully you got some information. But then start to engage your political leadership. If you don't like what you see in the world, you need to kind of state to your leaders that, listen, this is not a good course of action. It's not a good way of going about business. Just because we've done something the same way for many, many years does not always mean it's productive or good. We need to kind of take a look at ourselves and say, what are we doing? I'm at the point where I don't believe politicians have all the answers. I know that many of you are very ingrained in politics. I'm very skeptical. Right, left, Republican, Democrat, to me, it's all blurred. Used to be a time where they meant something. It's not really happening now. We as individuals must demand more. And if they can't produce, we must demand change. We have to look for alternatives.
Thanks, Professor Maniates. I don't have anything terribly original to add, I'm afraid. Educate yourself, contact your political representatives, make your voice heard, visit the websites of different NGOs and see if you support their position, and if you do, maybe make donations to Jewish Voice for Peace, to, if not now, maybe to UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Agency for Palestinians. Get involved, write letters. But yeah, there are no easy solutions. I don't have anything deep or meaningful to say, I'm afraid. Hate is real. Yes, and I guess it always will be.
Could you recommend some books or authors?
How about you?
All right.
Good.
Noam Chomsky, Norman Finkelstein, Efra Said, Iman Pape. I would recommend reading those.
I will also toss in Muhammad
That's
Ayub.
Professor Lubbers, by the way, if you'd like to talk to him.
Thank you. I will also toss in Muhammad Ayub, whose work on understanding political Islam is pretty important for conceptualizing both kind of the rise of extremism in the Islamic world and the potential resolution for many of these issues. Going back to the broader issue then, to how do you get involved, what can you do? I will echo both George and Conor in terms of educating yourself and acknowledging humanity. And I think that's where I want to land. I talk to my students in my government courses about our own American system, right? And everybody talks about the government, right? It's the government, capital, it's like it's some kind of monolith that exists over here. Our government and every system on this planet is functionally three things, right? It's a set of ideas and or principles. It is physical property, material, land, tanks, bombs, computers, whatever, right? And it's people, right? It's human beings. That's it. That's it. And the other two can't do anything without us. So when you think about the intractable problems of the world and all of the burdens of history and all of the complications and all of the war and the bloodshed, at the end of the day, you all go to sleep and don't wake up, and none of that continues. It is all the people that matter. And therefore, it is the people in which there can only be any solution. Yes, educating yourself is important, right? You want to talk about, how do you combat hate? Well, one of the ways is by understanding the dimensions of an issue and understanding why someone could be so mad they might do violence. That's why I started out talking about 9/11, right? We know what that feels like. If you've lost someone, if you've had someone taken from you, you know what that feels like. If you've ever found yourself in a position where you're like, I will absolutely punch that mother, right? You understand what that feels like. Common humanity and empathy give you those bits of knowledge and information. You've got to understand what that is. And you've got to choose not to do that, right? Hate is a choice. Violence is a choice, right? We choose it on a regular basis. And if you're going to have some leverage on changing the world around us, we have to make better choices. And that also means you've got to be brave. Because it's hard when someone you know is talking about vengeance or violence, or when someone gets wrapped up in a cause and they are clearly ready to do something, to be the person who looks at them and goes, no, you're wrong. You're asking other people to be hurt. That's hard. It's hard when someone is obviously grieving and in pain and reacting to the slaughter of civilians or the slow annihilation of their people, and look at them and go, yes, I understand why you feel that way, but you're making it worse and you have to stop. That's hard. It's easy to get caught up on either side, and it's hard to be the one person in a room full of people on the verge of conquest or on the verge of slaughter and be the one who goes, no. But if we don't, this is what happens. That's how you change the world. Yeah.
Sorry, it's just a little anecdote. It's not about Israel-Palestine. I have an elderly gentleman, a friend from Ireland. He's a journalist. And I'll never forget this story that he told me about an interview that he conducted with some guy from Northern Ireland whose daughter had been killed by terrorists, basically. He was interviewing this person in a pub in Belfast about the impact it had and how his life had been ruined, I suppose. What else would that do? And he asked him about his attitude to the people that had carried out this act. He said, I don't know, it's very hard for me to be sure. I think I finally managed to forgive them to some degree. And my friend said, well, yeah, but what would you do if you could get your hands on these people? And he said, well, don't look now, but see that guy in the corner by the fireplace? That's one of them.
Thank you very much. It's been a great panel. Let's, one more time, give our appreciation. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you at future events. This is what college is great about, is having these discussions. We may disagree, but we all get along in the end and make the world a better place. Thanks for coming.